With DJ Moore in the mix, wide receiver is no longer a top need for the Chicago Bears. But that doesn't mean they couldn't still use their first-round pick at the position.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, we debate, should the Chicago Bears still consider drafting a wide receiver in the first round, using either the number 9 overall pick or the potential, to trade down and still land a wide receiver, but largely the main point here being that first round pick, that precious first round pick. Using that at the wide receiver position that is no longer a massive need on this team versus using it at a position that looks to be a bigger need that might fill a more immediate hole that you only have so many opportunities to add young talent at, and why use it on a position that you're okay at when you could use it at a position that you absolutely need more players. We'll hit on both sides and then kind of figure out where the truth may be somewhere in the middle. Let's start with why they should. We see a lot of Bears fans, especially on Twitter, really excited about the possibility. I think it's largely Jaxon Smith-Njigba, whose last name I'm working on pronouncing better and more accurately because it's one I get tongue-tied on quite a bit. A lot of Bears fans like JSN as an option for the team. If not at the number 9 overall pick, certainly would like him after trading down a little bit to maybe feel like you're getting a little bit better, but I don't know. We can have a separate debate on whether JSN is worth the 9th overall pick or not. I'm more interested in talking about, more generally, the value of adding a first-round caliber wide receiver with that first-round pick versus other positions like an offensive tackle or an edge rusher or a cornerback that could be bigger needs or different players that you might prefer on your big board versus the wide receivers that are available there. And what it comes down to, I think, if we're making the case for why the Bears should draft a wide receiver, you can never have too many good wide receivers. You have not seen a team that you can say, wow, they just have too many wide receivers. And boy, it sure was bad that team had so many good wide receivers. I don't think we've gotten to the point yet where a team has so many talented players that you feel like, man, they overinvested in the wide receiver position. Has any team ever regretted getting too many good wide receivers on the roster? Certainly, if you invest in the wide receiver position a lot and the players aren't any good, you regret how much you invested in that, but you regret it because the players weren't good. And that's sort of the caveat here with the draft pick, right? Whoever you draft in the first round, you're taking them in the first round because you think they're good. So assuming that the first round pick that you add at wide receiver is going to pan out, if you add a Jaxon Smith-Njigba or even Quentin Johnston from TCU to a team that already has DJ Moore, Chase Claypool, Darnell Mooney, Velus Jones at wide receiver, you add one more weapon for Justin Fields, but not just any kind of weapon, a dynamic playmaking level of weapon that a guy like Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who, again, trying to be very intentional about it, Jaxon Smith-Njigba is a great slot player. A very high floor with a decent ceiling in there, too. People think he can be Cooper Kupp. He can be Julian Edelman. He can be Amon-Ra St. Brown. He can be a 1,000-yard guy, even if he only ends up as a primary slot receiver in the NFL. We talked about him a lot on yesterday's podcast, talking about the Ohio State Pro Day that he performed at. So we're not going to do a deep dive on JSN. If you want more on him specifically, we can go back to yesterday's podcast. I also have heard through the grapevine, I've been to pro days. I've been to the Senior Bowl. I wasn't at the Combine this year, but you have friends around the industry. And I've heard that some teams, many teams even, prefer Quentin Johnston from TCU as the top wide receiver in this draft. That they see him as a guy who offers more potentially than JSN, in part because Quentin Johnston has some of the physical tools that JSN does not. Again, I don't want to just rehash the JSN stuff, but like he's not a huge receiver. He's not tiny, but he's not huge, and he's not slow, but he's not fast either. And a guy like Quentin Johnston offers you a little bit more of that physical upside. He had a 40.5-inch vertical, 11'2" broad jump. He's 6'3", 210 pounds, vertical downfield receiver who's explosive. Like he's big, long, strong, fast, explosive. Like he checks the boxes as the guy in this draft class that looks like a number one outside wide receiver. It's the prototypical, put him on the outside and he can match up one-on-one and dominate guys and dictate coverages from opposing defenses. He's not Jamar Chase. He's not Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State, but he's built in that number one receiver mold where JSN is not. And again, I'm not here to sort of argue one versus the other in this part of the on the podcast today or right now, but more so if you add somebody like that with DJ Moore and Darnell Mooney and Chase Claypool, teams are not going to be able to bring that second safety down in the box to try and stop the running game, right? If you have either JSN or Johnston, doesn't matter to me, on the field with Moore and Mooney in an 11-person, like 3 wide receiver set, you cannot go single deep safety against that wide receiver group. You are going to leave your cornerbacks on the outside with one-on-one matchups versus the likes of Moore and Johnston or, Mooney and Moore with JSN then in the slot with a more favorable matchup. And so then if you have to leave your 2 safeties back deep, that makes Justin Fields' job easier in the running game or Khalil Herbert's job easier in the running game. One less guy in the box pre-snap. It just, when you add someone else at wide receiver of this caliber, it dictates so much more of what the defense has to do in response to you. It's also worth keeping in mind that Chase Claypool is going to be a free agent in 2024. And as of now, Darnell Mooney is going to be a free agent in 2024. And as much as there's optimism and hope that Chase Claypool can get better and get back to the high level of play that we have seen him play before, there's a chance he doesn't. And there's a chance he's mediocre this year and the Bears let him walk and don't sign him to a contract extension and he's gone. And then you're left with Moore and Mooney. And wouldn't you be wishing at that point that you had used a first-round pick on a wide receiver this year to have somebody already working with Fields, already getting in the mix? I know Marvin Harrison Jr. next draft, and that's the dream for a lot of Bears fans. But it just seems like it helps Justin Fields so much more right now to add one of these first-round rookie wide receivers into the mix here. It dictates the defense. It makes the running game better. It makes Fields' passing easier. And hey, there's still plenty of quality offensive and defensive linemen you can get later in the draft. But there's only one spot in the draft you can get a true difference maker at wide receiver. It's the first round is where you get the playmaker guys. Everything beyond that, you're looking at number 2, number 3 receivers or guys that are high risk, high reward that can be difference makers, but you're not sure. But if you want the sure thing or the closest thing to a sure thing playmaker, dynamic weapon at wide receiver, it has to be in the first round. Everywhere else, there's going to be red flags, there's going to be warts, there's going to be questions there. Whereas you can get starting caliber offensive linemen later on. You can get starting caliber defensive linemen later on. You can't get playmaking wide receivers elsewhere in the NFL draft to this caliber and to this consistency and to this upside all around. That's the argument as to why they should draft a wide receiver in the first round. It's also pretty easy to make the argument of why they shouldn't. Why it's not in the best interest of this football team the way it stands right now with all the needs and where they are in this roster construction to use a first-round pick on a position like this that's already maybe not a strength, but definitely not a weakness. We'll make that case in opposition next on Locked On Bears. This Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar, the makers of the world's best-tasting protein bar, and right now, the Built March Madness bracket is here. We know you have a favorite flavor of Built Bar or Built Puffs, and now's your time to make it count. If you go to BuiltMarchMadness.com, you can vote for your favorite flavors of Built Bar and Built Puffs. Every time you vote, you're going to be entered in for a chance to win a free box of Built Bars. 50 lucky Locked On listeners are going to get a box sent to them absolutely free. And one Locked On fan will get a 12-month subscription from Built to have Built's best bars or puffs delivered monthly straight to your door. You got to try Built Bars if you haven't yet. They really are incredible. They taste delicious. They taste like candy bars, but they're good for you. They're low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. And when you see some of the flavors in this Built bracket, trust me, you'll fall in love with them just like I have. So you can always pick up a box whenever you want at Built.com. They're in Walmart, they're in Sam's Club, and don't forget to run to BuiltMarchMadness.com to vote for your favorite puff or bar and win your box. You can vote every day in March, so hop in and support your pick. The Bears might not have the luxury right now of being able to use a top 10 pick, or even if they trade down, a first-round pick on a wide receiver. That might just be too much of a luxury for where this team sits in the team-building process. Don't get me wrong. Like we said, there's plenty of reasons to do it, and it's not like there is zero need at wide receiver, right? This isn't like it would be stupid to draft a safety in the first round. There's no reason to draft a safety. That would be, you got your two safeties. That's a luxury that they just don't need. Or to draft even a linebacker in the first round, like an off-ball linebacker, they just don't need one. You can't use the first round pick there. Wide receiver, you can say, okay, there is room to add more players there, but that would be a great move if you're like you need one more weapon to push you over the top, to get to the Super Bowl, to really put your offense, you're just one weapon away. Let's go get them with that first round pick. But in Chicago right now, as it stands today in late March, this team has a lot of holes. And there is a lot that still needs to be filled. And they just need talent also purely across the board. And so to use that first round pick, the one time you have to take a potential blue chip caliber player on a position where you already have a number one type guy in DJ Moore and some solid number two, number three types, presumably, and Mooney for sure, and Claypool maybe. And then, you got some other guys that are wide receiver 4s, 5s. Like the wide receiver position, if you don't touch it from now to training camp, it's okay. Like you don't need to. It would be cool to. It'd be a luxury. It'd be nice to add at wide receiver, sure. But you really got to do something on the offensive line. You really got to do something on the defensive line. And you'd like to upgrade at the cornerback position as well. Like those right now kind of seem like the big three positions. I mean, defensive line is multiple positions. Offensive line is multiple positions. So, big three is a little bit of a stretch there. But right, those are the spots that I think you look at in the first round where it's like, okay, that guy can plug in and play right away and help this team and also be probably a very good player. Like, of course, like if you don't like any of the offensive linemen, you don't like any of the edge rushers, you don't like any of the cornerbacks, sure, we could talk wide receiver a little bit more then. But like, as you look at this draft class and you put together your draft board, it's without a doubt, there will be at least one offensive lineman, edge rusher, or cornerback on the board at 9 that is worthy of being a top 10 pick. It's likely there will be one of each on the board. The likes of Witherspoon at Illinois or Gonzalez, the other cornerback, might both be there at 9. A few different pass rushers like Lucas Van Ness or some of the other guys. Tyree Wilson probably won't make it that far down, but there's the Clemson kid. I mean, there's a handful of edge rushers that could be there at that spot. A few different offensive tackles, Paris Johnson Jr. from Ohio State, or maybe Broderick Jones from Georgia. Or even Peter Skronsky might be a guard, but there's going to be good offensive linemen on the board there too. And so it's not like you're sitting there at 9 saying, well, we have to reach for an offensive tackle or reach for an edge rusher or reach for a cornerback instead of taking the wide receiver that clearly belongs as the guy at that pick. Like that's just not going to be the case. One way or another, it's highly likely that the best player available on the board or one of the best players available on the board will fit a position of need for the Chicago Bears. It happens to be a fairly sweet spot for the team. It might even be the case that you get to 9 and there's 3 or 4 guys that you like. There is a couple of tackles, a couple of edge rushers, and a cornerback, and maybe an interior defensive lineman too. And you say, okay, well, there's 4 or 5 guys that we like at 9. Can we trade back to 11, to 12, to 13, and land one of those 4 guys still, pick up an extra 3rd or 4th round pick or whatever it might be, still get one of those guys and feel like you're filling the need and getting the best value that you can for that spot? Is wide receiver giving you the best value there? I don't know. It's certainly sexier, right? But it's hard to sit there and say, hey, we have the chance to draft our week 1 starting right tackle, a stud at right tackle or a stud at left tackle at that number 9 pick where we desperately need one and we feel like this guy is a first round day 1 starter with high upside, but let's take the wide receiver because that would be fun and exciting and add something to this offense, sure, but at some point you kind of have to build the foundation first before you start adding, the toys, the luxuries, the fun stuff on top. You got to really fill out this roster with solid, consistent talent there. I think that's the offensive line. That's the defensive line. That's where the Bears have expressed a desire to build this roster from the inside out. And it's the spots that they have had the least success adding via free agency. They've added at both via free agency, but they need to add more at both via free agency. And it just feels like the draft capital, despite having 3 picks in basically the second round, two second-round picks in the first pick of the third round, those are still opportunities to add more players. But with that first-round pick, you can shore up one of the most important positions, likely in the trenches or cornerback, for the next 5 years plus, potentially, with a guy that you just feel like, okay, surefire thing, good to go. He's going to lock us in and give us something that represents stability and can be a cornerstone building block at these important trench positions that really set the tone for all the guys around them and can be that sort of long-term piece there that you feel like, okay, you're locked in and ready to roll. So it just feels to me like, yes, the wide receivers are good. There's a lot to like there, but it's a luxury, man. It really is. And this team is just not in that place right now where they can afford to get a little fast and loose with the first-round pick on something that would be fun and beneficial, but not really helping pay the bills in that same way. If you end up putting too many eggs in the wide receiver basket while also neglecting some of the other positions, you're going to pay for it and feel like, man, maybe they should have kind of addressed things a little bit differently to have a more well-balanced roster. And then you can start adding fun pieces once you get all the holes really filled. And again, the foundation is a little more set there. I think it's a little bit too easy to completely write off wide receiver, though. And I think for me, the way the Bears should approach this is not saying never wide receiver, no wide receiver in the first round, no matter what. And it also shouldn't be approaching it and saying, hey, you got to get a wide receiver because this is the only time you can get a wide receiver and we'll fill those other needs with later picks in the draft where it's a little bit less critical to get that playmaking type guy. I think there's a balanced approach that the Bears can take to this process where maybe you draft a wide receiver, but only if the circumstances really truly call for it, even only if that's really what's in the best interest of how the draft board is falling, how you evaluate the prospects, and how you sort of put some of these guys head to head. So we'll lay out, I think, the approach that Ryan Poles is going to take to some degree of not being too set hard and fast either way at the wide receiver position specifically, next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up today and claim that no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on anything from money lines to point spreads to which teams will be going farther in the March Madness tournament to NFL draft, prop bets, XFL, NBA basketball coming right around the corner with the playoffs too, and so much more, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your chance at that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA and NFL. I think there's a time and a place. There's a draft scenario where drafting a wide receiver, you know what? Okay. There are scenarios where that's the right move. And I think there's scenarios where it's not the right move. And I think Ryan Poles is going to let the board fall to him, really see the big picture of the draft, and make the decision not specifically based on, okay, what is my biggest need exactly, or how should I best, should I give Justin Fields that weapon versus filling some of these other holes? But I really think he's going to approach it, I don't want to say in a vacuum, but a little bit more as a reflection of the draft as a whole. I think more so than do you draft a wide receiver or are you drafting an offensive defensive lineman with that 9th overall pick, or if you trade down or whatever, the Bears need talent. They need to draft the best player available for their football team. And outside of the positions we talked about earlier, like safety and linebacker, outside of the kind of ridiculous positions, I'd throw running back in there too. No Bijan Robinson for me. Like outside of the positions that are just, you just don't have a spot for them right now. Outside of those spots, I'm not going to be too upset about who they draft at 9 if it's the best player that's there. If it's a good football player, if the player pans out, we're not going to care that, oh man, they took a wide receiver there when they really should have taken a tackle. If that wide receiver turns out to be really good, that's what matters. Is this player they draft at 9th overall going to play out their whole rookie contract at a high level and then sign a contract extension and stay with the Chicago Bears for another 4 or 5 years and maybe a third contract, but you know what I mean? Let's go one step at a time here, right? Get a guy that is going to be a foundational piece of your team no matter what, whether it's a foundational piece of your team at wide receiver that's here for 5 years or a foundational piece on the offensive line or on the defensive line. Get me the guy that's going to be a stud, that's going to be the player Ryan Poles can hang his hat on and say, yep, that was one of the key draft picks that helped build this team into a playoff contender and into a Super Bowl contender. That has to be the goal. They need talent. They can't get caught up on, man, right tackle is the biggest need. We have to take an offensive tackle at 9, because if you take Paris Johnson or Broderick Jones or one of these tackles when really you feel like, man, Lucas Van Ness would have been better, or man, Jaxon Smith-Njigba would have been better, or one of these, or Devon Witherspoon from Illinois would have been better. Like, you can't do that with the 9th overall pick. You have to take the guy that's going to hit for your team and be here for the long haul. You can't just funnel someone into a position where you have to get them. I also think Ryan Poles is going to approach this looking beyond the 9th overall pick and say, okay, in this draft class, you may say, yeah, we should get a tackle at some point. It's going to be important to get one. We should get a defensive lineman at some point or two. It's going to be important to get one. And if that's going to be a priority, not that it's important that you have to take one at 9, but you feel like, man, we probably got to make sure we can get one somewhere. You have to look then at your draft board and say, okay, how do I grade all the offensive tackles in this draft? Are there guys that how confident am I that there are guys that I think will be there when we're on the board with 2 picks in the second round and the first pick in the third round? How confident am I in those guys that will be on the board there to be guys that I think can start, to be guys that I have confidence in, to be guys that I have relied on? Do I have to take an offensive tackle at 9, or do I see enough in this draft class that I feel like unless I'm in love with this tackle at 9 and there's not other better players like Moore, I can wait on tackles? Same thing with cornerbacks. Same thing with defensive linemen. Do you like the edge rushers in the second round, or do you get there and you look around and you go, man, it's like this guy like Andre Carter from Army who's not really a great fit, or Nick Herbig from Wisconsin who's more of an off-ball linebacker, 3-4 edge rusher, not a 4-3 defensive end. Like, how do you grade out these draft classes? Where do you anticipate these draft classes having depth that you can get at that position to fill the need you might like to fill at some point in the draft? And then based on that, do I have to take one at 9? Or can I be happy with other guys at these bigger need positions later in the draft that won't be as good as the player at 9, but I'll still like what I can get elsewhere, and I can get a better player at a different position at 9 and get kind of the best of both worlds there. And that's where wide receiver comes into play for me. Because if you're Ryan Poles, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, you might look at this wide receiver class and say, Johnston and Jaxon Smith-Njigba are the 2 guys that we believe in. Maybe they like Zay Flowers. I mean, there's other wide receivers. But let's say hypothetically, let's say we think those 2 guys are bona fide studs. Everyone else, we got some questions about, might be able to be number 1 receivers, might not. Some of them are slot-only guys. Some of them are limited ceilings. We like the floor. Like, everyone else has some question marks, but these 2 guys are the only 2 guys we can get. But, we look at this offensive tackle class, and, there's Matthew Bergeron from Syracuse in the second round, maybe Jalen Duncan from Maryland. We like some of these second-round tackles. We feel like we can get one there that we like that's not as good as Paris Johnson or Broderick Jones, but, we'll be happy with them. So we don't need to take a tackle with that 9th overall pick. And you know what? On the defensive line, There's Keanu Benton from Wisconsin will be there in the second round. You've got a couple of different edge rushers, the Georgia Tech kid, Keon White. You got, I'm not as up on the second round prospect names quickly off the top of my head, but they're hypothetically, there's pass rushers we like in the second round. And no, they're not going to be the stud pass rusher that we might like at 9, but they're still going to be really good. We know they can still have sack protection, and maybe they have the upside to be a 10-sack guy. They're just not as sure of a thing. So, we don't have to take one at number 9. And, there's cornerbacks there, too, that we like. We took Kyler Gordon in the second round last year. We like these kind of cornerbacks in this range. So then, with that math, okay, we have to get the wide receiver here because we don't like the wide receivers later as much. So let's take that at 9 because we feel confident we can get tackles or centers or defensive linemen or cornerbacks in the second and third round that we like, but we got to get the wide receivers here. Or maybe it's different. Maybe they say, okay, you know what? We like Paris Johnson Jr. and Broderick Jones. I'm going to keep doing that. These are the only 2 tackles that we feel like are future Pro Bowl offensive tackles. We got to get one at 9. We like other guys, but they're not going to be Pro Bowl level players. They're just going to be average guys. And we feel like, you know what? We can wait on a wide receiver. We have DJ Moore. We can take a swing on a guy that maybe has some upside but some question marks and say maybe he pans out and gives us something great. Or maybe he doesn't, but we still have Moore and Mooney and maybe Claypool. So it's a luxury pick, so it doesn't have to be that sure thing stud wide receiver. We can take a chance on a guy that we like the upside of but maybe isn't as safe of a wide receiver pick. So we can wait on that. And we'll get our offensive tackle now because we just need one. We believe in these guys. So I think that's the way Ryan Poles is going to approach it. It's, hey, let's see how these positions weigh out over the course of the second and third rounds on our board, how we think they might go. It's never a guarantee, but generally where we feel comfortable with certain guys. And if we feel comfortable with a certain position later in the draft, maybe we don't need to take that one early in the draft. And that doesn't tell us whether it will be wide receiver or not, or whether it'll be offensive tackle or defensive line in the first round. But I think that's the smart way to approach it from a team building standpoint, understanding that these are needs and you feel like you do have to account for them somewhere, but there is no position that you absolutely have to fill the need with the 9th overall pick. 9th overall pick should be about getting the best player that you feel like you can't get anywhere else, that's rare, that's special, that's a sure thing to build around, regardless of whether that's a wide receiver or not. That's how I think the Bears need to approach this 9th overall pick, and why I think wide receiver is in the mix, but I think odds are low that ultimately ends up being the pick, but never say never. We'll see how the rest of free agency plays out. If they sign an offensive tackle at some point or a center or more defensive linemen, maybe that changes the math on how urgently they feel like they need to draft any of those positions. When they make any more roster moves, you can be sure we're going to break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, there's a new podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. It's called Locked On NFL Scouting. Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs break down the NFL from a team-building perspective, the different moves and how they fit into roster construction, salary cap, NFL draft, and so much more. Those guys have great chemistry. It's a lot of fun on the podcast. Go check that out for your second listen. Come on back on Monday for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.